Hello, government students. Hey, we got a picture here of the chambers of the United States House of Representatives. And today we're going to talk about the powers of Congress, and what better way to start about talking about Congress than to look at this beautiful House chamber in our Capitol building in Washington, D.C. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right to it. The powers of Congress. And we're going to begin by looking at Congress's legislative powers. We all know that the purpose of Congress is to make laws, right? As a legislative power. Legislative powers, therefore, are law-making powers. And our law-making powers are detailed in Article 1, Section 8, and there are two types of legislative powers. First of all, there are express powers. These are the powers that Congress or the government specifically is given in the Constitution. So some examples of express powers would be to levy taxes. It would be to maintain a post office. There's an express power to establish a uniform weights and measures, meaning are we going to use pounds or kilograms? Are we going to use miles or kilometers? Those are weights and measures. Congress has the power to establish and maintain an army and a navy. There's lots of them in Section 8. Those are just a few. But there are also implied powers. The implied powers are not specifically granted, but they are implied by the Constitution. And implied powers are also derived from Section 8, and specifically from Section 8's Interstate Commerce Clause and the Elastic Clause. The Interstate Commerce Clause in Section 8 says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce between the states and between the states and foreign countries. The Interstate Commerce Clause has been used to create things such as government-owned corporations, such as Public Broadcasting System, PBS, the television, public television, National Public Radio, NPR. Those are examples of things that do use interstate commerce, the airwaves that carry those radio and television transmissions cross state borders. So that would fall under the broad umbrella of interstate commerce. The Interstate Commerce Clause has also been used to do interesting things like make it illegal for a restaurant to refuse service to African Americans. As you well know from history, prior to about 1960 or so, African Americans could not eat at many restaurants in America. Or if they did eat at certain restaurants, they had to sit in certain areas of that restaurant. The Interstate Commerce Clause was used to outlaw those kinds of rules. You might wonder, well, what does that have to do with interstate commerce, crossing state boundaries? Well, if you think about it, at a restaurant, much of the food that is going to be served had to come from other states. The equipment that's being used to cook that food most likely came from other states. So the Interstate Commerce Clause has been used for the very laudable purpose then of outlawing that kind of heinous racial discrimination. And then there's the Elastic Clause. The Elastic Clause is the last part of Article 1, Section 8. We talked a little bit about this when we were discussing the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Elastic Clause says that Congress shall have the power to do whatever it deems necessary and proper to carry out all of its responsibilities that are discussed in the rest of Section 8. Basically, you might recall the Anti-Federalists really despised that clause because it stretched, hence the term elastic, it stretched the power of the government well beyond what they thought was wise. And it basically says that the government can do whatever the government thinks it needs to do, whatever, as the words say in that last clause, whatever the government deems necessary and proper. So let's give an example of how the Elastic Clause has been used. I said earlier that one of the express powers is that Congress can maintain an army and a navy. Well, it doesn't say anything about maintaining an air force, and yet we have an air force. Of course, in 1789, we didn't have air power, so of course it won't say anything about an air force. But now that we do have airplanes and air power available to us, it simply makes sense that if that is needed for our national security, then we should have it. After all, the Army and Navy is there for national security. If we need now air power and air force to maintain national security, it would certainly be implied that the Constitution would allow that. So that's the Elastic Clause, and that then would constitute our legislative powers. The express powers and implied powers are both our legislative powers. Let's look at some non-legislative powers. Non-legislative powers would include proposing amendments to the Constitution, approving or rejecting presidential appointments, and that power belongs only to the Senate, approving treaties, another power that belongs only to the Senate, impeachment, and the House of Representatives and the Senate each have a role in the impeachment process. And finally, appointing an acting president if none is elected. Of course, we'll get into the Electoral College later, when we get into the executive branch, but it is possible that there could be a tie vote. It's the Electoral College that actually picks the president, and that is based on the votes of people like you and I, but it is the Electoral College that meets and actually picks the president. And it's possible you could have a tie. And if there's a tie, then that means no one has actually been elected to be president. The House of Representatives then would have the power to select the president if none is elected by the Electoral College and by the people of the United States. That goes to the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote. So each state's delegation in the House would get together and decide who they want to pick for president, and then the House of Representatives as a whole then would vote to see who would be the president. So that's another non-legislative power. There are also, of course, limits to congressional power. The limits to congressional power are in Article 1, Section 9. Remember, the legislative powers are in Section 8. Limits to power are in Section 9. And those limits would include Congress cannot suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, you will recall, is your right, if you were ever charged with a crime, to have a court hearing and see the evidence that the police have that you committed the crime. So with that evidence, then you can mount your defense. Congress cannot pass a bill of attainder. I want to make sure you know what a bill of attainder is. A bill of attainder is a law that punishes someone without the benefit of a trial. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, the captain of a big oil tanker ship got drunk, and he grounded his big ship off the coast of Alaska while he was intoxicated. It put a hole in that tanker, and we had one of the worst oil spills in the history of the United States. This tanker was owned by Exxon Corporation, and Exxon, of course, was held to be responsible because Exxon's employee, the captain, was drunk. Congress passed a law fining Exxon millions of dollars for the cleanup of that oil spill. Exxon sued, saying that that law that fined Exxon a couple of $1 million was a bill of attainder. There was no trial. Exxon didn't go on trial. Congress simply punished them with a law. And Exxon actually won that lawsuit. That law was declared unconstitutional. It was a bill of attainder. Later on, Exxon was sued, and they ended up having to pay a lot of money to clean up that spill, but that had to come through a lawsuit. It could not come from a law passed by Congress, because that was a bill of attainder. Congress cannot pass ex post facto laws. You remember that. Those are laws that make something illegal, even though it was done before the law was passed. And the example I gave when we were discussing the Constitution of Illinois was, for example, if I'm clocked driving 70 miles an hour, and the speed limit when I drove 70 miles an hour was in fact 70 miles an hour, but then next week they lower that speed limit to 60, they can't send me a ticket because when I did drive 70, it was legal to drive 70, even though it's illegal now. That would be ex post facto, after the fact laws. Congress cannot tax exports. Congress can tax imports, but Congress cannot tax exports. That was an important issue in the early days of our republic, when the South was worried that the northern majority in Congress might seek to tax exports as a way to raise money. The South's economy was much more dependent on exports than the North's economy. So we do not tax exports, thankfully. That would really hurt our economy if we did. Congress can't give preferential treatment to one state over another. So, for example, you have a port of New York City, and adjacent to that is the port of New Jersey. Congress couldn't pass a law that would make the fees to use the port of New York less expensive than the fees to use the port of New Jersey. That would be treating the port of New York preferential to New Jersey. That's against the law. And Congress cannot grant titles of nobility. As much as I might deserve it, I cannot be named a duke or an earl or a lord of any sort, so you will never be able to call me Sir Vaughan or whatever the case may be. We can't grant titles of nobility. Now, it is possible for Great Britain, the UK, to grant an American a title of nobility, but that title will be meaningless in America. It would only mean something if you traveled to the country that granted you that title. There are some special powers for each chamber, and we'll finish our presentation by looking at some of these special powers. Let's start with the House of Representatives. All money bills must begin in the House of Representatives. That means any bill related to how we're going to spend the money and how we're going to collect money in taxes. All of those bills start in the House of Representatives. And all impeachments begin in the House. That is, it's the House of Representatives that charges an official with wrongdoing. That's the impeachment beginning. And in fact, when you are first charged with wrongdoing, that does mean you were impeached. Okay. The Senate has some special powers. The Senate approves the presidential appointments, which I discussed already. The Senate approves treaties, and that does require a 2/3 vote, which is pretty difficult to get sometimes. We don't have a whole lot of treaties because it's difficult to get a 2/3 vote. And then the Senate conducts the impeachment trials. And in order to convict and remove an official from office, you have to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree to do that. So the impeachment process begins in the House. The House impeaches someone by charging them with wrongdoing. And then the Senate puts them on trial. And if they get 2/3 of the senators to vote to convict, that individual then will be removed from office. And impeachment, by the way, isn't just directed at the president. Members of the president's cabinet, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, those individuals can be impeached. And members of the federal judiciary can also be impeached. And that's it for our presentation today. Be sure that you check Canvas. There might be some assignment there for you. I'm not sure. And regardless if there's an assignment or not, have a great day.